She had worn this dress to her father's burial. That was the first thing people noticed when Margaret Ashford walked into the Redemption Creek courthouse on the morning of her wedding. Not the groom she had never properly met, not the judge who looked like he wished he were somewhere else entirely, but the dress. Black wool high collar, brass buttons down the front. A mourning dress. A dress that said everything she could not bring herself to speak aloud. 3 weeks had passed since they'd lowered her father into the frozen Wyoming ground. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and creditors' notices slid under the front door like accusations. 3 weeks of watching everything Marcus Ashford had spent his life building begin to crumble at the edges, the farmhouse, the fields, the stubborn, beautiful, impossible dream of making something out of this unforgiving land. And now this. "You sure about this, Margaret?" Judge Halford asked, peering at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who already knew the answer and found it depressing. "I'm sure," she said. Her voice came out flat and even. She had practiced that too. Cole Merritt stood beside her with trail dust on his boots and a jaw set so tight she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of river water before a storm. He hadn't looked at her directly yet. She hadn't looked at him directly either. There was a mutual, unspoken agreement happening between two strangers who had both separately run out of options. The courthouse smelled like old paper and consequences. Behind them, arranged like a tribunal of the self-righteous, sat Harlan Voss, banker, town council chairman, and the man who had manufactured this entire catastrophe with the precision of someone who had done it before. He wore a gray suit and a satisfied expression that he did not bother to disguise. Beside him, his lawyer. Beside the lawyer, 3 council members who owed Voss various favors of the kind that were never spoken about in polite company. And behind them, filling the remaining benches, half of Redemption Creek. Come to witness. Come to watch Margaret Ashford, the woman they had spent a decade whispering about, finally and completely lose. They had called her many things over the years. The professor's daughter said with a particular snarl that made professor sound like a disease. The reader, which was meant as an insult, and which she had long since decided to accept as a compliment. The leftover, which was what they called women who reached a certain age unmarried and were therefore deemed broken, cursed, or simply too difficult for any decent man to want. She was 32 years old. She had read every book in the county lending library twice. She could calculate compound interest faster than the bank clerk, and had once, during a heated town council debate, identified a surveying error that saved 3 farms from misattributed tax claims. Not a single person had thanked her. Several had suggested she had gotten above herself. This was the world Margaret Ashford moved through, and this was the world that had arranged this morning. "Do you take this woman?" Judge Halford began. "I do." Cole Merritt's voice was low and certain, not enthusiastic, not warm, but certain in the way of someone who has made a decision and intends to honor it regardless of the cost. The judge turned to Margaret. The room held its breath. She could feel it, that collective terrible anticipation, the hope from some quarters that she would crumble, that she would weep or refuse or make a scene that would give them something to talk about for the next 5 years. She did not give them the satisfaction. "I do," she said, and looked straight at Harlan Voss when she said it. His smile flickered. Just barely. Just enough. "Then by the authority of the Wyoming Territory," Judge Halford said, sounding like he wanted to apologize for it, "I pronounce you married. God help you both." No flowers, no celebration, no kiss. Cole Merritt did not attempt one, and she was grateful for that. Just 2 signatures on a document that felt less like a marriage certificate and more like a surrender agreement witnessed by a room full of people who would spend the walk home deciding what it meant. Outside, the cold hit her like a second judgment. Edna Greer, the Methodist minister's wife, materialized beside Margaret as she descended the courthouse steps. Edna had been making Margaret's life difficult since 1875 and showed no signs of stopping. "Don't look, sweetheart," Edna murmured to her daughter, steering the girl physically away. "Women like that carry bad fortune. It's not her fault, really. Some people are just marked." Margaret kept walking. She had learned over a decade of similar comments that responding only gave them ammunition. Silence was a shield, not a perfect one. It didn't stop the blows, but it was all she had most days, and she had gotten very good at holding it. Cole caught up to her at the wagon. He had long legs and moved quickly for a man who had, by his own account, ridden 3 days straight from Denver to arrive in time for this ceremony. That woman, he said, tilting his head back toward Edna, she just, she's been saying variations of the same thing for 10 years. Margaret arranged her skirts on the bench seat with the automatic mechanical precision of someone going through motions while their mind was somewhere else entirely. I've stopped hearing it. He was quiet for a moment. That's not true, though. She turned to look at him. It was the first time their eyes had actually met. No, she admitted quietly, it's not true. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and drove them toward the Ashford farmhouse without another word. Behind them, she could hear Redemption Creek murmuring in their wake speculation, judgment, and the particular pleasure of a small town watching someone else suffer. She faced forward and did not look back. The silence between them stretched for 2 miles. Cole broke it first. I should tell you something, he said, that this is only a business arrangement. Margaret kept her eyes on the horizon. I know what it is. You needed land access to satisfy my father's creditor notes. Notes that Harlan Voss bought specifically to manufacture this situation. I needed a husband to prevent the bank from seizing the property at midnight. Neither of us would have chosen this under any other circumstances. That's accurate. He paused. I was going to say something else. What? I'm not going to be difficult. I'm not going to make demands, and I intend to work. He said the last part with a particular emphasis, like it was a promise he'd made to himself before making it to her. Margaret studied the side of his face for a moment. Strong jaw, tired eyes, the kind of weathering that came not from laziness, but from hard seasons and harder choices. My father was a literature professor from Philadelphia, she said. He believed that education could conquer anything. He was brilliant at teaching Keats and terrible at growing wheat. He's been dead 3 weeks, and I have 70 acres of failing farmland, a barn that needs a new roof, and creditor notices I've been using as bookmarks because there are too many to stack neatly. I will not pretend that doesn't matter. She paused. I'll show you where you'll sleep when we get there. The Ashford farmhouse was a study in the collision between aspiration and reality. From the outside, it had the bones of something that might have been beautiful wide porch stone foundation, windows set at angles that caught the afternoon light. From the inside, it was a library that had accidentally grown a kitchen. Books occupied every surface that wasn't strictly necessary for human survival. Agricultural manuals and poetry collections shared shelves with medical texts and territorial law guides. A chalkboard Marcus Ashford had mounted on the kitchen wall still held a half-finished calculation about crop rotation alongside a quote from Emerson that someone had underlined twice. Cole walked through, slowly, not touching anything, just looking. He read a great deal, he said finally. He believed in ideas. Margaret set down her coat and moved toward the stove. The land didn't care about ideas, but he couldn't stop believing in them, so he kept trying. She was quiet for a moment, her back to Cole, her hand still on the kettle. I think that's why he left me the way he did. Not because he failed, but because he never stopped trying, even when trying stopped working. There's a kind of honor in that, and a kind of tragedy. You loved him. Completely. She turned around. Which is why she gestured vaguely at the space between them, the house, the absurd fact of their marriage, feels like the worst possible tribute to his memory. He wanted me to inherit this place on my terms. Instead, I've inherited it under yours. Cole held her gaze steadily. I understand that. And I meant what I said in town. I won't force. I know. She cut him off, not unkindly. The judge explained the arrangement. Your brother's gambling debts acquired through a series of increasingly poor decisions in Denver. Harlan Voss purchased those notes at a discount and used them to construct a legal situation where your only viable option was marriage to someone with land adjacent to the proposed railroad corridor. She pulled 2 cups from the cabinet. Your brother is named Daniel. Cole blinked. How did you know that? Voss told me. She poured water into the kettle. When he came to this house 4 days after my father died, he sat in that chair right there, she pointed, and explained the entire plan to me with the cheerfulness of someone who has done a thing so many times it no longer bothers them. He wants this land, Mr. Merritt. He has wanted it for years. The railroad territorial line will run directly through the eastern quarter of these 70 acres. Whoever controls this property controls commercial access to Redemption Creek's future. She set the kettle on the stove and faced him directly. We are both pieces on his board. I thought you should understand that completely. Cole was still for a long moment. Then he sat down heavily in the chair across from the one Voss had occupied, and she watched him absorb the full weight of what she had said. He planned it, Cole said. He bought Daniel's debt on purpose. 6 months ago, I bossed in the date in the county records. She sat across from him. He knew your brother was in trouble. He waited until the debt was large enough to be useful, purchased it from the original creditor, and then waited for the right moment. The right moment was my father's death. The silence between them changed quality. It was no longer the silence of strangers being careful with each other. It was the silence of two people recognizing at the same moment the size of the thing that had been done to them. So we're both trapped, Cole said. Yes. Margaret reached into the drawer beside her and withdrew a slender book. Not a novel, not a textbook, but something handmade. Dark leather cover pages sewn by hand, the ink inside faded but legible. She set it on the table between them without opening it. But I may be less trapped than Voss believes. Cole looked at the book. What is that? My mother's ledger. Margaret's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more careful, like she was touching something that could break. She died when I was 12. Before she died, she kept records. Financial records, every transaction my father made with Voss's bank, every loan, every interest payment, every communication. She was meticulous. She didn't trust banks in general, and Harlan Voss specifically, and she documented everything. Margaret ran one finger along the cover without opening it. I didn't understand what I was looking at until last year. When I finally did, I understood why Voss wanted this land badly enough to wait 6 years for it. Cole leaned forward. What does it show? That my father never owed as much as Voss claimed. Her voice was very quiet. That the interest rates in his records don't match the rates in the bank's official ledger. That there are debt entries attributed to the Ashford account that my mother's documentation proves were never incurred. She met his eyes. My father didn't die owing money, Mr. Merritt. He died because Harlan Voss was manufacturing debt to force a sale, and when my father discovered the discrepancy and threatened to expose it, the pressure, the legal harassment, the constant financial terror broke him. She paused. I believe that. I can't prove it yet, but I believe it. Cole stared at the ledger for a long moment. That book, he said carefully, could destroy Voss. If the right person sees it at the right moment, yes. She picked it up and slipped it back into the drawer. But I am one woman in a territory that does not take women seriously, with documentation that a good lawyer could argue is biased or incomplete. I need more. I need time. And I need, she hesitated, the word clearly costing her something. I need help. He was looking at her differently now. Not with pity, she would have thrown him out for pity, but with the particular attention of someone recalibrating. Show me the land tomorrow, he said. All of it. And tell me everything you know about Voss's operation. Why? Because if he manufactured this marriage to trap us both, then the most logical response is to use the marriage he created against him. The corner of Margaret's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she'd come to one in 3 weeks. You'll sleep in the room at the end of the upstairs hall, she said. My father's study. There's a cot. That's fine. It's not comfortable. Neither is sleeping on trail dirt, but I managed. She stood and moved toward the hallway, pausing at the doorway. Mr. Merritt? Cole. She considered that for a moment. Cole, I want to be clear about what I expect from this arrangement. I don't expect affection. I don't expect performance. I expect honesty, consistent effort, and the understanding that I am an equal partner in any decision that affects this property. Can you agree to that? He stood as well, and the lamplight made the tiredness in his face look less like weakness and more like weathering, the kind that meant a person had been tested and was still standing. Yes, he said. I can agree to that. She nodded once and went upstairs. He listened to her footsteps until they stopped, and then he sat back down in Marcus Ashford's chair and stared at the drawer that held the ledger and thought about a man he had never met, who had apparently spent years fighting the same enemy Cole had walked into today. He thought about Daniel, about the money he had paid out to cover his brother's recklessness, the horse and the saddle and everything else he had sold the future he had quietly laid down like an offering. He had told himself it was loyalty. He was beginning to understand it might have been the purchase of a completely different life, one he hadn't known to expect. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the failing fields, and somewhere above him in her father's house, Margaret Ashford was not sleeping either. The first week passed in parallel. Cole worked the south fields from first light until his hands cracked. Margaret managed the household accounts, taught reading lessons to 4 children in the evenings, and communicated with Cole primarily through notes left on the kitchen table because direct conversations still felt like something that needed to be approached carefully the way you approach a fence you aren't sure will hold your weight. South fence line needs posts. Hardware store owes us credit on the Morrison account. Irrigation ditch east of the barn is blocked, probably debris from last month's freeze. There are oats in the storage bin left of the door. You are allowed to eat them. That last one had made him stop and read it twice, and he couldn't entirely account for what he felt when he did. On the fifth morning, she found him in the barn before sunrise, studying the irrigation system her father had built with the expression of a man trying to be diplomatic about something structurally catastrophic. "Say it," Margaret said from the doorway. Cole turned. He had not heard her approach. She was wearing work clothes, heavy skirt, wool coat, hair pinned back with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had no patience for impracticality, and she was carrying a lantern that made her face look angular and determined. "Your father was a gifted man," Cole said carefully. "He was a genius who had never farmed before moving to Wyoming at 41. Say what you're actually thinking." Cole looked back at the irrigation channels. "He designed this system for a Philadelphia garden. The water distribution is," he picked his words, "aspirational. It doesn't work. It works about 30% as well as it needs to." Margaret set the lantern on a post and walked over to stand beside him, looking at the same channels. "I know. I've known for 2 years. I couldn't fix it because I couldn't afford the labor and couldn't do it alone." "Can you do it with 2 people?" She looked at him sidelong. "That depends on whether the second person knows what they're doing. I grew up working irrigation on a ranch in Colorado before my father died, and Daniel and I ended up in Denver." He crouched down beside the main channel, examining the grade. "Give me a week and I can triple the water flow through the north fields. 2 weeks for the full system." "We may not have 2 weeks." She crouched beside him. "Voss called a special water allocation meeting for the end of the month. He's going to propose reduced water access for underperforming properties. It's designed specifically to strangle us before we can show improvement. Then we start today." He looked at her. "Both of us." She picked up a shovel that was leaning against the barn wall. "I assumed as much," she said, and drove it into the dirt. They worked through the morning without stopping, and somewhere around noon, when the cold Wyoming sun had moved high enough to take some edge off the wind, Cole noticed that Margaret Ashford worked with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else, total fierce, and completely unwilling to acknowledge physical limits until her body forced the issue. He caught her twice, adjusting her grip to hide the blisters forming on her palms. "Stop," he said. "I'm fine." "Your hands are—" "I said I'm fine." She drove the shovel in again, then stopped. Set it down, looked at her palms for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm not fine," she said in a completely different voice. Flat, empty of the armor. "I'm so far from fine that I don't remember what fine felt like." Cole said nothing. He had learned already in 5 days that Margaret Ashford did not want to be managed or comforted. She wanted to be heard, which was a different thing entirely. "My father borrowed money to buy seed 3 seasons ago," she said. "He couldn't repay it. Voss extended the loan at a rate my mother would have recognized immediately as fraudulent, but she was gone by then, and my father trusted people who seemed educated and authoritative. He trusted them because he was educated and meant to be trustworthy himself, and he couldn't imagine a world where men of standing lied so systematically." She picked up the shovel again. "That cost him everything, and it will cost me everything too unless we find a way to change the game." Cole picked up his own shovel. "You said you have documentation in the ledger." "I have a beginning." She started digging again. "I need corroboration. Other farmers who've been subjected to the same tactics. Bank records I don't have access to. And time which Voss is working very hard to ensure I don't get." "Then we build both at once." Cole worked the next section alongside her. "We fix the irrigation, show improved yields, And while we were at it, we start talking to other farmers. Your mother's ledger might not be the only record of Voss's methods. Margaret paused mid-dig, turned to look at him. That, she said slowly, is not a bad idea. You sound surprised. I'm recalibrating. She resumed digging. I expected a man willing to work. I didn't expect a man willing to think. Cole felt something in his chest shift very slightly, like a door settling on new hinges. I'll try not to disappoint you, he said dryly. The ghost of a smile crossed her face, brief and complicated and entirely real, before she looked back at the ground and kept digging. They visited Frank Dawson's farm on a Tuesday. Margaret had been planning the approach for 3 days, running calculations in her mind, while she taught reading lessons and reviewed creditor documents, and lay awake listening to Cole move through the house in the hours before dawn, the sound of someone else's insomnia oddly companionable. He's suspicious of me, she told Cole in the wagon on the way over. He's always been suspicious of me. I'm the professor's unmarried daughter who reads too much and has opinions about irrigation. You're the professor's married daughter now, Cole said. That buys approximately 30 seconds of different suspicion before he remembers who I am. So let me start. She turned to look at him. You want to lead the conversation? I want to get us through the door. He kept his eyes on the road. After that, you're better at this than I am, and we both know it. She considered that for a moment. That's a surprisingly self-aware thing to say. I have my moments. Frank Dawson opened his farmhouse door with the wariness of a man who had learned that unexpected visitors usually wanted something he couldn't afford to give. He was 60, weathered into something that looked like it had been carved from the landscape itself, of all hard angles and reluctant permanence. Merritt, he said, acknowledging Cole. Then, with measurably more caution, Mrs. Merritt. Dawson. Cole kept his voice easy, conversational. We won't take much of your time. My wife has something she'd like to discuss with you about your south field irrigation. Frank's eyes moved to Margaret. What about it? Your yield dropped 40% last season, she said directly, because Frank Dawson was a man who respected directness even when he didn't like the person delivering it. I know why. Your irrigation ditches are set at the wrong grade for the soil composition on the south slope. The water is evaporating before it reaches the root depth of your crop. I can show you how to correct it. We just redesigned our own system this week, and the difference is already measurable. Frank studied her. Why would you do that? Because I need something in return. She held his gaze. You have surplus wheat seed from last autumn. I need enough to plant our north field. We trade consultation for seed. You get better yields next season. I get a chance to survive the water allocation vote. We both come out ahead. The old farmer looked at Cole. She always liked this. I'm starting to think yes, Cole said. Frank snorted, not warmly, but not hostilely either. Then he stepped back from the door. Come in then. Let's talk about it. 2 hours later, they left with seed enough for half the north field and Frank Dawson's grudging acknowledgement that the irrigation advice was sound. On the wagon home, the late afternoon light turning the Wyoming plains the color of old copper. Cole looked at Margaret. You're good at that, he said, at what making people hear you, even people who have already decided not to. She looked out at the fields passing. My father taught me that intelligence without communication is theater impressive to the performer, useless to the audience. He was the most brilliant man I ever knew, and he died partly because he couldn't make the right people understand what Voss was doing to him. She paused. I won't make the same mistake. Cole reached over and without particular deliberation placed his hand briefly over hers on the seat between them. She didn't pull away. He moved his hand back to the reins. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that happens between people who have begun carefully and with justified caution to trust each other. The note arrived on Friday. Margaret found it slipped under the front door in the early morning before Cole was awake. It was written in a hand she didn't recognize on paper that had been folded and refolded, the kind of thing someone composes and reconsiders several times before finally committing. Mrs. Merritt, I worked for Voss's bank as a clerk for 4 years. I saw things I was told to forget. I have records I was told to destroy. I didn't destroy them. If you're serious about fighting him, I think I can help. I can't sign this. You'll understand why. Leave a lantern in your east window if you want to meet. Margaret read it 3 times. Then she went to the kitchen, made coffee, and was still sitting at the table when Cole came downstairs 20 minutes later, his hair uncombed and his eyes carrying the particular look of someone who had slept badly for days and was learning to function through it. She handed him the note without preamble. He read it, sat down, read it again. This could be real, he said. It could also be Voss testing whether I'll take bait. Could be both, real and a test. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the morning was doing something quietly beautiful with the light over the eastern fields, and she noticed it the way she noticed most things these days, as something happening at a distance through glass. If I don't respond, I lose whatever they're offering. If I do respond and it's a trap, we set a counter trap. Cole looked up at her. We accept the meeting. We prepare for the possibility it's surveillance. And we go in with nothing incriminating that he doesn't already know. He paused. What does your instinct tell you? She was quiet for a moment. That it's real. That someone who worked 4 years in that bank has been carrying something heavy and the weight of it finally got too great. Then put the lantern in the window. That night, a woman named Rose Hennessy arrived at the farmhouse back door with a canvas satchel pressed against her chest like something precious and unbreakable. She was perhaps 40, with the careful, contained movements of someone accustomed to being watched. She sat at Margaret's kitchen table and spread out what she had brought, and for the next 2 hours, Margaret's mother's ledger found its corroboration. The documents Rose Hennessy laid out told the same story from a different angle. Loan records altered after signing interest rates shifted by a decimal point in the bank's master file debt amounts, inflated by a combination of compound fees that were not disclosed at origination. The same pattern, the same hand, repeated across 8 different properties over 12 years. Why didn't you go to the sheriff? Margaret asked. Rose's laugh was short and without humor. The sheriff's salary is paid by the town council. The town council is chaired by Harlan Voss. I went to the territorial land office 2 years ago. She straightened one of the documents. My next-door neighbor's barn caught fire 3 days later. No evidence of cause. Nothing ever proven. The kitchen was very quiet. How many people know about this? Cole asked. Me. Now you. Rose looked at Margaret steadily. And the federal land auditor out of Cheyenne who I wrote to last month. He hasn't responded yet, but he has what I sent him. She paused. I heard about your wedding. I heard the way the town talked about you. And I thought she already has nothing to lose. She might actually fight. Margaret looked at the documents spread across her mother's kitchen table. Her father's house. The land that 3 generations of wrong decisions and 1 deliberately manufactured catastrophe were trying to take from her. I have 1 thing left to lose, she said, and I intend to keep it. She reached into the drawer beside her and took out her mother's ledger and set it on the table beside Rose Hennessy's documents. The 2 sets of records fit together like the 2 halves of a case that had been waiting 12 years to be made. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed cold and close against the windows, and somewhere in town, Harlan Voss slept the sleep of a man who believed he had already won. He did not know that in a farmhouse kitchen on the property he had been systematically destroying for years, 2 women and a man had just assembled the evidence that would end him. Not yet, but soon. The days that followed moved with the strange double rhythm of a life being built and a war being quietly prepared. On the surface that Redemption Creek could see Cole Merritt and his new wife were doing what everyone had privately predicted they would fail to do, working the land. They were out before dawn and still working after dark, visible from the road, visible to the neighbors who rode past with varying degrees of curiosity and sympathy and poorly concealed satisfaction at waiting for the inevitable collapse. Beneath that surface, something else was happening entirely. Margaret had a system. She had always had systems. It was one of the things the town found unsettling about her, that a woman would approach problems with the methodical thoroughness of an engineer rather than the resigned patience they considered appropriate to her sex. But this system was her finest yet. While Cole rebuilt the irrigation channels with the focused competence of a man who had spent years working land and knew exactly what he was doing, Margaret was building something else, a map. Not a literal map, though she had one of those too, tacked to the inside of the pantry door where no casual visitor would see it. What she was mapping was something more complex. A network of debts, Relationships favors grievances and dependencies that constituted the real architecture of Harlan Voss's power in Redemption Creek. She had been collecting pieces of this map for 3 years. She had done it quietly the way she did most things, through careful observation, through the conversations that happened at the edges of social events she attended as a ghost rather than a guest. Through the records the county courthouse was required by law to make available to any citizen who asked. People had not paid attention to her requests because people had never paid attention to her requests. That invisibility which had cost her so much in one direction had given her a kind of freedom in another. She knew which farms were thriving and which were struggling and why. She knew who had borrowed from Voss and at what rates, and she knew which of those rates were legal and which were not. She knew that the Rodriguez family had excellent livestock but no grazing access. She knew that Lucy Huang's family had strong crop yields, but no market relationships, selling at a disadvantage because they didn't know who to talk to. She knew that the Peterson widow Harriet had 4 children and a farm that needed twice the labor she could provide and twice the money she had. What she hadn't had before was a reason to use any of it, a vehicle for turning information into action. Cole Merritt had given her that entirely by accident, by showing up in her life at the worst possible moment and turning out to be, against all reasonable expectation, someone she could work with. "You look like you're planning something," he said one evening, finding her at the kitchen table surrounded by her ledgers and notes and the census records she had convinced the county clerk to let her copy. "I'm always planning something. Something specific." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, and she noticed, as she had been noticing more frequently and with increasing discomfort, that it had become natural, him sitting across from her at this table, that the house had rearranged itself around 2 people without anyone making a conscious decision about it. "We need allies," she said. "We can't fight Voss directly with what we have. The ledger and Rose's documents are powerful, but they're not enough on their own, not in a territory where every official answer to 'Who do you believe, Margaret Ashford or Harlan Voss?' starts with a presumption in his favor. We need other people standing beside us, people he's hurt who are willing to say so." Cole considered this. How many playing? Enough to make a pattern that can't be dismissed as personal grievance. She turned one of the pages toward him. "Frank Dawson's yield problem isn't just irrigation. Look at this, his loan rate from 2 years ago. It's 7 points higher than the advertised rate that Voss's bank posted that same week. He probably doesn't even know." Cole studied the numbers. "You think he's been overcharged? I think a lot of people have been overcharged, and I think most of them don't know it because they trusted the bank and never compared documents, because trusting institutions and not comparing documents is exactly what Voss relies on." She tapped the page. "But if we show them, they might not want to know." Cole looked at her. Some people find it easier to continue trusting something that's hurt them than to acknowledge how badly they were fooled. "Well, will." She leaned back. "Won't. We find the ones who won't." He was quiet for a moment, watching her with that quality of attention she had gotten used to, without meaning to, the kind that didn't try to simplify her. "You've been fighting this alone for years," he said. "Yes. And now you're not." She met his eyes. "And now I'm not." Something moved between them. Not said, just acknowledged, and then she looked back at her documents, and he looked at his coffee, and they let it settle where it landed. They went to Lucy Huang next on a morning when the cold had retreated just enough to make the walk from the wagon to the farmhouse door something other than an ordeal. Lucy answered before they knocked, which meant she had seen them coming and made no move to avoid the encounter, a promising sign. She was 35, sharp-featured and watchful, running a farm that her family had built from nothing over 20 years, with a precision that Margaret had always admired from a distance. The Huang family's crops were the envy of half the county. Their market outcomes were a fraction of what they should have been. "Mrs. Merritt," Lucy said, and the fact that she used the new name rather than the old one meant she had already absorbed the marriage and decided where she stood on it. "Mr. Merritt, come in." Her kitchen was different from Margaret's, organized with a different kind of efficiency, walls hung with tools rather than books. But it had the same quality of being a space that a serious person took seriously. "Your family has the strongest yields on the eastern side of the county," Margaret said, sitting down without waiting to be invited, which Lucy clearly respected because she sat down as well without comment. But you're selling at the commodity rate at the Redemption Creek market, which is the lowest available option, and costs you roughly a third of your potential income. You don't have to. Lucy's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. The market is what it is. The market that Voss controls, through his arrangement with the market commission share, is what Voss makes it. There are buyers in Cheyenne and Laramie who pay 30% more for quality grain, and the only reason your family doesn't have those relationships is because no one with access to those buyers has ever bothered to make the introduction. And you're offering to how? I'm offering a trade. You have market access problems. I have market knowledge and introductions to make. We have an alliance of farms developing that can pool negotiating power with outside buyers or individually. We're small collectively. We're worth taking seriously. Margaret looked at her steadily. What I need from you is information about your experience with Voss's bank, loan terms, correspondence, anything you have kept. Lucy was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Cole. You knew what you were marrying, she said. It was not quite a question. I'm still figuring that out, Cole said honestly, but I think yes. The corner of Lucy's mouth moved. She stood and went to a cedar chest in the corner of the kitchen and came back with a tin box that she set on the table and opened without preamble. I kept everything, she said, because my grandmother told me to always keep everything with a bank. She grew up in a country where that was how you survived. She spread several documents on the table. I didn't know what it meant. Maybe you do. Margaret looked at the documents for 30 seconds and knew exactly what they meant. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. If you can actually use this, Lucy looked at her, then thank me after. Soon. The Rodriguez family came third on a day that started cold and turned colder. Ramon Rodriguez was a compact, deliberate man who listened to Margaret's entire proposal without interrupting and then sat silently for so long that Cole was beginning to reconsider the wisdom of the visit. Then Ramon stood, went to his back window, and looked out at the grazing land, visible beyond his fence line, land that belonged to 3 different absentee owners, and sat unused while his cattle had nowhere adequate to range. If your alliance can negotiate grazing access, he said without turning around, I will give you 3 months of field labor and my brother's cooperation in Laramie, where he works at the Territorial Land Office. He turned then. My brother has seen things in those records, things that involve Voss. He has been waiting for someone to come to him. Margaret's heart, which she had spent 3 weeks keeping very carefully controlled, did something complicated. Tell your brother, she said steadily, that we're coming. By the end of the week, the alliance had 7 families. By the end of 2 weeks, 12. The logic was the same in every case. Margaret had something each family needed, and each family had something she needed. And what she was really building was not a coalition so much as a demonstration that cooperation was more powerful than competition, which was the thing Voss's entire system depended on people not figuring out. Cole watched it happen with the quiet attention of a man recalibrating his understanding of something he thought he already knew. He had known in the abstract that intelligence was useful. He had not known before Margaret Ashford that intelligence combined with patience and strategic empathy could dismantle structures that brute force couldn't touch. He also knew, though he hadn't said it to her, hadn't found the words that would carry the weight without sounding like performance, that he was in significant personal danger of caring far too much about what happened to her. Not to the property, not to the plan, to her specifically, Margaret herself with her ferocious mind and her careful bravery and her habit of standing very straight when she was trying not to show fear. He was thinking about this unwisely in the middle of repairing the east fence when the riders appeared. 3 men on good horses, the kind of horses that cost money. They stopped at the fence line and one of them called out across the field, Merritt, you're wasting your time out here, you know. That land's cursed. Everyone who's worked it has failed. Cole kept working. The rider pressed closer. I'm serious. The woman's father spent 8 years killing himself on that dirt. And what did he get for it? A pauper's funeral and debts that dragged his daughter into a fraudulent marriage. A pause that was clearly meant to land harder than it did. Walk away while you still can. Margaret's voice came from behind Cole. He had not heard her approach. If you have finished, she said in a tone so controlled it could have cut glass, I suggest you ride back to whoever sent you and tell them that your visit had the opposite of its intended effect. She looked at the rider with the flat, unsentimental directness she brought to everything. We have work to do. The rider blinked. Whatever he had expected from Margaret Ashford, tears perhaps, or pleading, or the particular crumpling that people expected from women who had been worn down for years, he had not expected that. The three riders exchanged a glance and rode away. Cole turned to look at Margaret. Where did you come from? I was checking the irrigation output in the north section. She looked at where the riders had gone. They'll report back that we're still here and still working. Voss will escalate. How do you know? Because that's what men like Voss do when mild intimidation doesn't work. They escalate. She turned back toward the house with the calm of someone who has already wargamed this several steps further than everyone else. I want to review Rose's documents again tonight. There's something in the margin notes I keep coming back to. Cole fell into step beside her. You're not frightened. I'm terrified. She didn't look at him. I've learned to process the terror while continuing to move. It's a skill. I've had a lot of practice. The town meeting was held at the church hall on a Thursday evening with a turnout that suggested either genuine civic concern about the drought or the community's reliable appetite for watching something go wrong in public. The pews were full by the time Cole and Margaret arrived, taking seats near the back. Harlan Voss stood at the podium in a suit that cost more than most families in the room earned in a month. He had the particular physical confidence of a man who has been the most powerful person in every room he has entered for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to be otherwise. Margaret watched him arrange his papers with the precise, unhurried movements of someone performing authority rather than exercising it, and noted the exact angle of his smile and did not look away. Given the severity of our current drought conditions, Voss began, his voice carrying the warm reasonableness he used the way other men used weapons. The council has been working to develop a fair and efficient water allocation system. The health of our agricultural community depends on ensuring that limited resources are directed toward properties that demonstrate productive use. As a community, we cannot afford to support failing enterprises at the expense of thriving ones. Cole felt Margaret's hand tighten on the seat beside her. Not on his hand, she had not taken his hand, just tightening the physical expression of something she would not otherwise show. He's building the legal framework, she said under her breath. The productivity threshold he's about to propose will be set at exactly the level that excludes us. He's had it calculated. Therefore, Voss continued, the council proposes a new water allocation ordinance. Properties failing to demonstrate yields within acceptable productivity thresholds for the current and preceding 2 seasons will receive reduced water access proportional to their productivity deficit. Properties consistently underperforming will have access reduced by up to 40% effective immediately following the vote. 40%. Without water at that reduction level, the North Field crops would die within 3 weeks. The South Fields within 5. The Alliance worked the seed from Frank Dawson. The irrigation repairs every piece of the scaffold they'd been building. All of it would become irrelevant. Margaret was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. Cole stood beside her automatically before he'd consciously decided that either, and realized as he did it that this was how it worked between them now, not by agreement, just by alignment. By having spent enough hours working in the same direction, that parallel movement had become natural. Mr. Voss, her voice filled the hall without effort. The room turned. The productivity threshold you've described, where is the methodology? How are acceptable yields calculated, and by whom? Voss's smile remained intact, but something behind it shifted. Mrs. Merritt, I didn't realize you had expertise in agricultural policy. I don't need expertise in agricultural policy to notice that your proposal contains no defined methodology, no named calculation standard, and no appeals process, which means the determination of what counts as an acceptable yield will rest entirely with the body that proposed the ordinance. She looked at the council. That body is chaired by the man who holds notes on 6 of the 12 properties most likely to fail the threshold. Would anyone like to discuss the conflict of interest before we vote? The room murmured. Not an agreement, not yet, but in the particular way that rooms murmur when someone has said a thing that was already being thought. Voss's smile hardened at the edges. These are serious accusations, Mrs. Merritt. They're serious questions, which is different. She kept her voice even and her eyes on the council. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. I'm asking the council to table the vote until the calculation methodology is made public and reviewed by at least one party without a financial interest in the outcome. She paused. That is a reasonable request. If the proposal is legitimate, transparency costs nothing. A long silence. Then Frank Dawson, from 2 rows forward, spoke without standing. I'd like to see the methodology too. Lucy Huang, as would I. 3 other voices from the Alliance family scattered through the room, each adding their weight. Voss did not look rattled. He was too controlled for that. But Margaret was watching his hands, and they moved slightly differently for a moment. A small adjustment. The physical tells that control cannot quite reach. The council will consider the request for additional transparency, he said, which was not agreement and not refusal, and meant that he was retreating to regroup. The vote is postponed, pending methodology review. As they left the meeting, Cole leaned close to Margaret. You just won a battle. I bought time, she corrected, which is what I needed. She pulled her coat closer against the night air. He'll move faster now. He knows we're organized. How much faster? She looked up at the winter sky, the stars hard and cold over Redemption Creek, and said something that wasn't quite prophecy, but turned out to be accurate anyway. Fast enough to do something he'll regret. The regret took the form of a man named Tanner who arrived at their property on a Saturday night and left without anyone seeing him. What he left behind was visible the following morning when Cole walked the irrigation channels at first light and found the work of 3 weeks destroyed. Rocks packed into the main channels, 3 key joints pried apart with a tool that had left distinctive marks on the wood. The water flow they had tripled, reduced in a single night to something barely adequate for the kitchen garden. Cole stood in the cold morning looking at the destruction for a long time. Then he went inside and said her name very quietly and waited while the news traveled across her face like weather disbelief first, then rage, and then beneath the rage, something that scared him more than anger did. Grief, the kind of grief that comes from believing just briefly that you might be losing. She did not cry. She had told him she did not cry, and she was largely right, but her eyes went very bright and her jaw set in a way that he recognized now as her version of the same. He did this, she said. We can't prove it. I know. She was already moving toward the door, toward her coat and her boots and the lantern. Let's start. They worked through that night by lantern light. Cole thought she would reach her limit somewhere around midnight, but she didn't. She reached several places where she should have stopped and passed through each of them, and he matched her because she was his wife in the only sense that currently mattered, and he wasn't going to let her do this alone. At 3 in the morning, with frost forming on their gloves and the channel still half repaired, Cole heard the sound of a wagon on the approach road, then another, then voices low and carrying through the cold dark. Frank Dawson's wagon came first, loaded with Frank himself, his 2 sons, and enough tools to outfit a construction crew. Heard you had trouble, Frank said, climbing down with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done this kind of work his entire life. Bad news travels fast in this county. He reached for a shovel. So does loyalty when it's earned. Lucy Huang's family came next, then the Rodriguez men, then Harriet Peterson with her 4 sons, the youngest barely old enough to carry a bucket, but carrying it anyway with the seriousness of someone who understood the stakes. By sunrise, 12 people were working the channels. By mid-morning, the work of one night's sabotage was undone, and the irrigation system was better reinforced than it had been before. Rocks packed in as protection rather than obstruction. Joints not just repaired, but improved with joints of Lucy Huang's son's design that were considerably more elegant than what had been there originally. Margaret stood in the field at noon, surrounded by the noise and motion of a community that had chosen her and was still. Cole found her there, not celebrating, not crying, but still in the particular way that happens when something enormous shifts. He stood beside her and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the morning hadn't already said better. After a moment, she leaned slightly into his shoulder. Just slightly. Just enough. He did not move. Shaw. It was Harriet Peterson who first called it what it was. Standing over the afternoon meal that the Alliance families had collectively produced from their various households, bread and salted pork in a bean soup that was better than it had any right to be given the circumstances, Harriet looked around the table that was really 3 tables pushed together and said in her direct, unsentimental way, We're a community now. When did that happen? About 3 weeks ago, Lucy Huang said, and looked at Margaret, and Margaret looked back, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a smile, but was the emotional equivalent. That evening, alone in the house for the first time in days, Cole found Margaret at the kitchen table again. The ledger was in front of her. She had been adding pages, a new section in her own handwriting that cross-referenced her mother's original entries with Rose Hennessy's documents and the materials Lucy Huang had provided. "It's almost enough," she said without looking up. She knew it was him by his footstep now without having to look. "For the federal auditor, it's not complete. There are two property accounts where I still have gaps, but if Ramon's brother and Laramie can fill those in, it becomes a case that a federal court would take seriously." "How long to get what you need from Laramie?" 2 weeks if we send word tomorrow." She looked up. "But Voss is not going to give us 2 weeks. He accelerated after the town meeting. He'll accelerate again after the sabotage failed." She set down her pen. "Cole?" The way she said his name had changed over the past 3 weeks. He had noticed it the same way he had noticed everything else carefully without making it mean more than it did, without assigning it weight he didn't have confirmation for. But it had changed. From his name to something closer to the name she called him in her own mind, which was different. "What?" "I'm frightened," she said. Not with the careful distance she had used before, just the fact of it plain. "I know. Not of losing the land." She looked at the ledger, at her mother's handwriting and her own. "Of losing this, what we've built, the alliance, she paused, partnership." Cole sat down across from her. "You're not going to lose it. You can't promise that?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "But I can tell you that everything Voss has thrown at us has made us stronger, not weaker. The irrigation sabotage brought 12 families to our door in the middle of the night. The town meeting showed the community that his numbers don't stand up to scrutiny. Every escalation exposes something." He leaned forward. "He's winning the small things because he controls the small things. But he's losing the larger thing, and I think he knows it." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "When did you get good at this?" she asked. "At what?" "At seeing clearly." "I've always been decent at it," he said. "I've never had something worth seeing clearly before." She looked away, and he knew it was because she didn't want him to see her face just then, and he let her have that. "Go to Laramie tomorrow," she said. "Take the letter to Ramon's brother. Whatever he has, bring it back. And while I'm gone, I'll be here." She put her hand flat on the ledger. "Working." He was at the door when she spoke again. "Cole," he turned. "I'm glad it was you," she said. "Whoever Voss was trying to trap me with, I'm glad it turned out to be you." He held that for a moment, said it somewhere careful. "Get some sleep," he said. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in 3 weeks." "I look like someone who hasn't slept since her father died and a stranger appeared in her life and turned it completely upside down." "Same thing." He left before she could respond, which was deliberate because there are moments that end better uncomplicated, and he was getting better at recognizing them. Cole returned from Laramie on the fourth day with mud on his boots and a canvas satchel that he set on the kitchen table with more care than its plain exterior suggested it warranted. "Ramon's brother," he said. He looked tired in the way that travel does to people's surface tired, the kind that sleep addresses, not the deeper kind that had been living in both their faces for weeks. "His name is Eduardo. He's been a clerk at the Territorial Land Office for 11 years. He said he's been waiting for someone to ask." Margaret was already opening the satchel. What Eduardo Rodriguez had given them were copies, careful, precise copies, made over the course of those 11 years of land transaction records that should have been mundane and were not. Property assessments filed with the Territorial Office that were inconsistent with the assessments filed simultaneously with local banks. Sale records for properties that showed buyers paying at market rate to the previous owner, while bank records showed a dramatically lower purchase price, the difference appearing nowhere in official documentation, but traceable if you knew where to look through a parallel set of transfers to a holding entity called the Meridian Land Trust. Margaret spread the documents across the table and did not say anything for a very long time. Cole made coffee and set a cup near her elbow and sat down and waited. "Meridian Land Trust," she said finally. "Do you know what that is?" "I looked into it in Laramie. It's a Wyoming territorial incorporation. Registered in 1879. "Who holds it?" "Nominally a businessman named Carver based in Denver." But Eduardo, Cole reached into the satchel and produced a folded letter. Eduardo did some research of his own. Carver is a nominee holder. The beneficial owner of Meridian Land Trust is Harlan Voss. The kitchen was very quiet. He's been buying property, Margaret said slowly, at below-market prices manufactured by the debt schemes documented in my mother's ledger, transferring them through a trust structure to obscure his ownership in accumulating land along the projected railroad corridor. She sat back. The railroad isn't just valuable to him because of commercial access. He's been acquiring the land it will run through. When the railroad pays for right-of-way Voss collects on property he bought for almost nothing from families he drove to bankruptcy. She looked at Cole. This isn't fraud on the scale of local banking irregularities. This is territorial scale land speculation through manufactured insolvency. This is federal. Yes, Cole said. The federal land auditor that Rose Hennessy contacted. I sent Eduardo's materials to the same auditor yesterday from Laramie, before I left. He paused. I hope that was... Yes. She exhaled. Yes, that was right. She put her hand over her eyes for a moment, and he saw in the brief exposure of that gesture how much she had been carrying and how long she had been carrying it alone. How long before the auditor responds? Eduardo said he'd had a preliminary response when I left. The auditor is requesting an in-person meeting with a primary witness. Cole looked at her steadily. He wants to meet with you. Margaret lowered her hand. Me? You have the original documentation, your mother's ledger, and you have the standing as an affected property owner. Eduardo and Rose are witnesses, but you're the through line, the person who connects the original records to the current situation. He paused. You're the case. She sat with this for a moment. When he's coming to Redemption Creek, 2 weeks. Voss will know a federal auditor is here within hours of his arrival. Yes, Cole met her eyes, which means we need to be ready for what he does when he finds out. The warning came in the form of a legal document delivered by a deputy sheriff on a Monday morning, 3 days after Cole returned from Laramie. Margaret read it on the porch, Cole at her shoulder. He's filing for injunctive relief, she said. He's claiming the alliance we've built constitutes unfair interference with legitimate market activity. He wants a territorial court order to dissolve the cooperative farming arrangement. Cole read the document over her shoulder. Can he do that? He can file anything. Whether it succeeds is different. She lowered the papers. But even a failed injunction takes time and money to defend. Time we don't have, and money we definitely don't have. She turned the document over in her hands. This isn't about the injunction succeeding. This is about forcing us to spend resources on defense instead of offense. So we don't defend. She looked at him. We don't file a response, he said. We don't engage the territorial court at all. We move our attention entirely to the federal case. Let him chase shadows in the territorial system while the auditor is building something he can't stop in a system he doesn't control. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's a risk. If the injunction goes through by default, the alliance dissolves on paper. But the relationships don't dissolve. The knowledge doesn't dissolve. The market connections you've built, the trust, none of that is in a legal document. He looked at her. Is it? No. She folded the injunction carefully. No, it's not. Then let him have the paper victory. We're building something that can't be taken by paper. She put the injunction inside and went to write to Eduardo Rodriguez and Rose Hennessy, and she did not think about the territorial court again. What she thought about in the hours that followed was a conversation she had overheard 3 weeks ago at the Redemption Creek General Store. She had been there for lamp oil, which was nearly the only thing they could consistently afford, and she had come around a corner of shelving to find Edna Greer in conversation with 2 other women, and she had stopped before they saw her. They say she's turned that useless farm into some kind of commune, one of the women said, trading favors, organizing the farmers. My husband says it's unnatural. It's temporary, Edna said with the certainty of someone who needs very badly for things to be temporary. She's always had ideas. The ideas never last. She married, though. That surprised people. Being married doesn't make you respectable. It just means someone was desperate enough. Edna paused. Or was maneuvered into it. Poor man doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. Margaret had stood very still behind the shelving for a moment. Then she had picked up her lamp oil and gone to the counter, and paid and walked out with the particular straight-backed calm that she had spent a decade perfecting as armor. Outside, she had sat in the wagon for a long minute before Cole climbed up beside her. "What happened?" he said immediately, because he had become without her entirely meaning to allow it someone who could read her face. "Nothing new," she said, "just old things remixed." He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had done something she hadn't expected. He hadn't tried to fix it or reframe it or point out that the women were wrong. He had just said quietly, "I know," and taken up the reins and driven them home. She had thought about that for a long time afterward, the particular comfort of being known rather than argued with. The legal notice about the educational activities arrived on a Wednesday, which was also the day the first wheat shoots appeared. Margaret was in the north field when Cole called her name, and she turned, expecting something good. There had been a quality in the morning that felt like a door opening, and instead found him holding the deputy sheriff's second notice of the week. She read it standing in the field with new green just visible in the rows behind her, which was the kind of irony that felt deliberately designed to be cruel. $500, she said, for teaching children to read. He's filing it as unlicensed educational services. It's free reading lessons, 3 evenings a week. I know. He knows. He doesn't care. She lowered the paper. The green in the field behind her was real. She had touched it that morning, felt the fragile certainty of it. $500 is everything we have and don't have. If we pay it, we lose the ability to function through the water vote. If we don't, the charge goes to the territorial court and gives him a platform to publicly discredit everything I've built. Cole was quiet for a moment. What does the statute actually say? She looked at him. The Educational Services Statute. What does it actually define as requiring licensure? She was already walking toward the house. She read for 4 hours. Cole brought her coffee and did not interrupt, and she appreciated both of these things in equal measure. What she found at the end of 4 hours was not a solution exactly, but a place in the legal language where the thing being prohibited and the thing she was actually doing were different enough to matter. Paid instruction, she said, reading aloud, for monetary compensation or goods of equivalent value. She set the book down. I'm not paid. The families contribute labor, farm work, fence repair. That's not compensation. That's community exchange. Cole leaned across the table. Would a judge accept that argument? A good judge, reading the statute honestly, yes. A judge with ties to Voss, she let that finish itself. But there's more. The statute requires licensure for instruction designed to replace formal education. I'm not replacing anything. There's no school within 25 miles of half these families. Their children have no alternative. I'm not a replacement. I'm the only option. That's a compelling argument. It's a true argument. She sat back. I'm going to represent myself. Margaret, we can't afford legal representation. We couldn't afford it before, and we certainly can't now. She met his eyes. I know the statute better than most lawyers in this territory because I read the statute 2 hours ago with no previous assumptions and nothing to prove except what it actually says. My documentation is thorough. My testimony will be clear. She paused. And I intend to tell the truth, which is a distinct advantage over the opposing counsel. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you need from me? Come to the hearing. Sit where I can see you. She gathered the papers. And trust that I know what I'm doing. I already do, he said simply, and went to make dinner. Dad. The hearing was held on a Friday in a courtroom that smelled like cold stone and institutional patience. The judge was a man named Alderton, 60-something, white-bearded, with the look of someone who had heard every possible argument and arrived at most sessions already tired. Voss's lawyer from Cheyenne was young and sharp and clearly accustomed to winning, and he watched Margaret walk to the front of the courtroom with the relaxed confidence of someone expecting a short afternoon. Mrs. Merritt, Judge Alderton said, I understand you're representing yourself. Yes, Your Honor. That's unusual. Yes, Your Honor. It's also necessary. She placed her documentation on the table. I'm prepared to proceed. Voss's lawyer's presentation was smooth and professional and relied heavily on the word unlicensed, repeated at intervals that were clearly calculated for effect. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting, which seemed to disconcert him slightly. He had clearly expected her to fidget or object or show the anxiety he was trying to provoke. When it was her turn, she stood and looked at the judge directly. Your Honor, the statute in question defines educational services requiring licensure as paid instruction provided in exchange for monetary compensation or goods of equivalent value. She placed the statute text on the table. My instruction is not paid. The families I work with contribute farm labor, fence repair, field work, equipment maintenance that I would be doing myself otherwise. That is not compensation. That is community exchange. The relevant case from the Second Circuit in 1882, she placed a second document on the table, establishes that labor exchange between neighbors for mutual benefit does not constitute economic transaction under territorial commercial statutes. She paused to let that settle. Furthermore, the statute requires licensure for instruction designed to replace formal education. There is no school within 25 miles of the families whose children I teach. There is no formal educational alternative available to them. I am not a replacement for something that exists. I am the only option. She produced her attendance documentation. 12 children ages 6 to 14, none of them previously literate. Current reading levels assessed here across a period of 8 weeks. She set the assessments on the table. That is not criminal enterprise. That is the only available response to an educational absence that territorial policy has failed to address. The silence in the courtroom was different from the silence she had been practicing against. Voss's lawyer stood. Your Honor, emotional appeals. Sit down, Judge Alderton said without inflection. He studied her documents for a very long time. Then he looked up. Mrs. Merritt, your argument is legally creative and your documentation is thorough. I'm reducing the fine to $50 and recommending the Territorial Board review Rural Education Compliance Standards. He set down the papers. That is the extent of my jurisdiction in this matter. $50, still impossible, but not $500. Outside the courthouse, Cole caught her as her knees registered what the rest of her had been suppressing for 2 hours. $50, he said. $50 we don't have. We'll get it. He kept his hand on her arm. Come home. Shayna. The Alliance meeting happened 2 days later in the yard of the Merritt farmhouse on a cold afternoon that smelled like the particular clarity that comes before snow. Margaret had not wanted to call it. She had spent 2 days arguing with herself about asking people who were struggling to give what they could not afford, and she had lost the argument when Cole pointed out gently that the Alliance had not been built to serve Margaret, it had been built together, which meant its problems also belonged together. She stood before 12 families and told them the truth. Harlan Voss is using every legal tool available to bankrupt us before the water allocation vote. If he succeeds, we lose not just this property but the organizing center of everything we've built. The grain pool, the market agreements, the literacy program. She did not soften it. $50. That's what we need, and we need it within 30 days. The yard was quiet. Then Harriet Peterson said, I'll give 5. Lucy Huang? The same. Frank Dawson, who had started this as the most skeptical man in the county. 10. Because you saved my yield and had never once made me feel like a fool for not knowing what you knew. He paused. And because my daughter read me a letter last week that she wrote herself. First letter she's ever written. He stopped, cleared his throat. $10. They collected $63. Margaret stood in her yard holding it and could not speak, which was unusual enough that it silenced the crowd. Cole spoke for her. She built this, he said. Every single person standing here she brought together through work and honesty and the refusal to accept that failing alone is inevitable. If she hadn't come to your farms, you'd still be struggling alone, and Voss would still be the only person in this county with a plan. He looked at the assembled families. The money matters. But what you've just told her matters more. That she's not alone. That this community is real. He looked at Margaret. Tell them. She found her voice. I've spent 12 years believing I was the problem, she said. That being too educated, too unmarried, too independent was the thing that made me unwelcome here. That the isolation was my fault for being something they couldn't accommodate. She looked at the faces around her. You've shown me the isolation was never about me. It was about a system that profits from isolation. a system that needs us competing against each other to keep us manageable. She held up the money. This is not charity. This is what it looks like when a community decides to exist. I don't have words adequate for what you've given me today. So I'll just say this, I will not stop. The yard erupted. That night, alone in the house with the ledger on the table between them, Margaret looked at her mother's careful handwriting and felt something crystallize. The auditor comes in 4 days, she said. I know. When he comes, he needs to see all of it. Rose's documents, Eduardo's records, the ledger, the testimony from every Alliance family willing to give it. She ran her finger along the page. But he also needs to understand what Voss knows he's coming. Cole looked up. You think he's already been told? Harlan Voss has been the most powerful man in Redemption Creek for 12 years. He has informants I haven't identified and connections I don't know about. She turned to face Cole directly, which means we don't wait for Voss to make his next move. We make ours first. Cole leaned forward. What move? We go public, not with accusations, with documentation. I write a letter to every family in the Alliance, to the Redemption Creek Gazette, to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne. I present the facts of what Voss has been doing, the pattern of debt manipulation, the Meridian Land Trust, the manufactured insolvency of at least 8 properties I can document in terms clear enough that any person with basic literacy can understand them. She paused. I strip away his ability to manage the narrative privately. Once the information is public, suppressing it becomes impossible. Cole looked at her for a long moment. If you do that, he said carefully, there's no going back. Right now, Voss might still see you as manageable. Once you publish, he'll stop seeing me as manageable and start trying to destroy me directly. She met his eyes. Yes, I know. And you want to do it anyway. I want to do it because it's the right moment, and because she paused, and the thing she said next cost her something. He could see it in the way her face moved around the words, because I have realized that I am done waiting for permission to speak. From the town, from the system, from anyone. She looked at him. I am done being quiet because quiet is safer. Quiet didn't save my father. Quiet has never saved anyone. Cole held her gaze for a long moment. Then, write the letter. I'll help you. They stayed up until 2 in the morning. She wrote and he read aloud what she had written, which was how they found the passages that were too technical and the ones that were not technical enough, and how she discovered that having someone read her work back to her in the plain voice of someone who had not already convinced themselves of the conclusion was the most useful editing tool she had ever encountered. By the time they were done, the letter was clear, documented, devastating, and true. She sent it to the Gazette with the Morning Post. By afternoon, copies had been left at every farm in the Alliance and passed from hand to hand through the western edge of the county. By evening, Harlan Voss knew. And by midnight, the wheat barn was on fire. She smelled the smoke before she heard Cole's voice. It came through the window she had left cracked despite the cold, a habit from childhood when the house ran hotter than it should have. And her father, who believed in fresh air with the conviction of a man who had grown up in Philadelphia row houses, insisted that a crack of outside air was medicine. She was asleep, and then she was awake, and the particular quality of the smell cut through every layer of sleep fog with the efficiency of something that the body recognizes before the mind does. Fire, wheat, ruin. Cole was already outside. She found him at the barn door in the half-dark, holding a bucket, with the expression of someone who had already done the calculation and arrived at an answer they refused to accept. The barn was fully involved, flames moving through the dry timber, with the purposeful speed of something that had started fast and spread faster, which meant this had not been an accident. Accidents were tentative. This was deliberate. Stay back. His voice was flat with forced control. The structure is going. The wheat, Margaret. He stepped in front of her. The wheat is gone. The whole harvest. A pause. Stay back. She stood in the dirt yard in her nightclothes and watched 8 weeks of reconstruction burn. The town came eventually, drawn by the smoke column visible from a mile off in the pre-dawn dark. Some of them brought buckets. Some brought concern. A few brought the particular blank face of people who had expected this outcome and found in its arrival a kind of vindication, though they would not have used that word. Sheriff Briggs arrived last, taking statements with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had concluded the outcome of his investigation before conducting it. Any idea how it started? He said to Cole. Arson, Cole said. That's a serious accusation. I know what I'm accusing, and I know it's serious. Briggs looked at Margaret. Mrs. Merritt, I understand you published some significant claims about Mr. Voss in the county paper yesterday. I published documented facts. Some would say the timing is suggestive. She looked at him steadily. The timing is suggestive of exactly what it suggests, Sheriff. We published evidence of Voss's land fraud yesterday. Our barn burned last night. The connection is not subtle. She paused. Are you going to investigate or not? Briggs's face went careful. We'll look into it. I'll be watching what looking into it produces. She turned back toward the smoking ruins. Good morning, Sheriff. He left. The crowd dispersed with the particular energy of people who have witnessed something they are not sure how to process. Frank Dawson lingered. He was the last to leave, standing near the ruins with his hat in his hands and an expression that was more anger than sympathy, which Margaret found oddly more comforting. What do you need? He said. Time, she said. And a federal auditor who arrives in 4 days and finds a case solid enough to act on immediately. Frank replaced his hat. You'll have people here tomorrow to help you document the damage for the insurance claim. We don't have insurance. For the record, then. Paper trail. His jaw set. You're not alone in this. I know. She said it differently than she used to say it. I'm beginning to understand that's real. Cole found her at 2 in the morning sitting on the porch with her mother's ledger in her lap and her eyes on the dark field where the wheat had been. He sat down beside her without asking if she wanted company, because he had learned that asking gave her the option of being wrong about what she needed. I should have sent the letter 3 days earlier, she said. No. If I had, the barn still burns. He was always going to burn it. Cole leaned forward, elbows on knees. He just needed a reason that felt justified to himself. The letter was our reason. Before the letter, it would have been something else. He looked at the dark field. Men like Voss don't need cause. They need permission, and they grant it to themselves. She was quiet. The harvest, she said. The vote is in 12 days. We needed the yield evidence. I know. Without it, we reframe. He turned to look at her. We've talked about this. The water allocation criteria aren't legally restricted to crop yields. They're defined around community contribution and productive use of resources. We make the case on community grounds. The council won't find that compelling without precedent. The families who come to speak for you are the precedent. He kept his voice level. 12 families. What you've built for them, the literacy program, the market access, the grain pool, the irrigation improvements, that's documented, provable, and real. It doesn't burn. He held her gaze. He can take the wheat. He cannot take what you have given this community. He cannot unread the books those children read. He cannot disconnect the market relationships Lucy's family has now. He cannot take back the knowledge Frank used to save his South yield. He paused. The harvest was evidence. The community is proof. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long time. You're very good at this, she said finally. I had a good teacher. Oh, she almost smiled. Don't flatter me. I'm not. I'm saying something true. He held her gaze. You taught me that the most powerful thing you can give someone is not a resource, it's a changed understanding of what's possible. You've done that for every person in that alliance, and they know it. That's why they'll show up for the vote. She looked down at the ledger in her lap. My mother kept this for 12 years and never knew if it would matter. She documented everything carefully with no certainty that anyone would ever see it or use it. She ran her thumb along the spine. She just kept the record because it was true and truth mattered, and that was enough reason. And now it's going to matter. If the auditor acts in time, he'll act. You can't know that. No, Cole reached over and I put his hand over hers over the ledger. But I know that you built a case that can't be ignored by anyone reading it honestly. I know that you did it with less resource and less support and more opposition than anyone should have to work against. And I know, he paused, that whatever happens in that courtroom or at that vote, you change this town. You already changed it. That can't be unburned. Margaret looked at his hand over hers. She had been very careful over the past weeks to note what was happening between them without drawing conclusions. It was a habit from her academic training, observe record, do not theorize prematurely. But there were observations that accumulated to a point where the only honest response was to acknowledge what they added up to. Cole, she said, yes, I am falling in love with you. She said it with the same directness she brought to everything, because euphemism had never served her, and she was too tired tonight for anything except the plain truth. I want you to know that, and I want you to know that I am entirely aware of how inconveniently timed it is, and I am also aware that I cannot control it any more than I can control the water allocation committee. He was very still for a moment. It's not inconveniently timed, he said. It's 12 days before the most important vote of our lives. Loving someone doesn't have inconvenient timing. It has timing. He turned her hand over under his so that their fingers interlaced. And I have been waiting for you to say that for 3 weeks. She looked at him. You've known for 3 weeks. I've suspected for 3 weeks. I've been fairly certain for about 10 days. He looked at her steadily. I was waiting for you to arrive at it in your own time because I know you well enough to know that being pushed would have been the wrong approach. That is an irritatingly accurate reading of my character. I've been paying attention. She looked at their joined hands. Then she looked at him fully without the careful guard she kept in place for the rest of the world and let him see what was there. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was quiet and certain, and nothing like the contracted transaction that had started this. It was the opposite of that, every possible opposite. The thing that happens when two people who have been very slowly and carefully choosing each other finally let that choice be visible. When she pulled back, the Wyoming night was still cold, and the barn was still ash, and the vote was still 12 days away. None of the practical problems have changed, she said. No, he agreed. We still have no harvest and no money and a federal case that may or may not move fast enough. All true. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had never done before, and felt how natural it was, and filed that information in the part of her mind that she was beginning to trust more than she used to. Then let's not waste the night worrying about things that will still be there in the morning, she said. They stayed on the porch until the stars moved and the cold deepened, and Redemption Creek slept its various sleeps around them, some peaceful and some not. And for the first time in 12 years, Margaret Ashford was not alone in the dark. 4 days later, the federal auditor arrived. His name was Grant Whitmore, and he was not what Margaret had imagined. She had constructed in her mind a bureaucrat, gray-suited, cautious, inclined towards the kind of procedural patience that is a polite way of doing nothing. What she got was a compact man of 50, with a watchful, particular face and the bearing of someone who has seen a great deal of human dishonesty and has developed over the years a specific allergy to it. He came alone, which was interesting. He sat at her kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked at the materials she spread before him with the focused attention of someone who is reading not for information they lack, but for confirmation of information they already possess. The Meridian Land Trust, he said, registered 1879, beneficial owner Harlan Voss. I've seen 4 similar structures in 3 other territories. He turned a page. The methodology is consistent. Manufactured debt, inflated interest rates, pressured sale trust, acquisition, railroad corridor, accumulation. He looked at her. This is not Mr. Voss's first operation of this kind. The kitchen was very still. He's done this before, Cole said. The territorial office in Colorado has an open investigation involving a comparable land trust registered in 1876. 2 properties in Kansas show the same signature pattern. Whitmore set down the document. The reason the territorial responses have been inadequate is that each instance looks in isolation like local banking irregularity. No single jurisdiction has seen the full picture. He looked at her documents, then at her. Until now. Margaret held his gaze. Will it be enough? Your mother's ledger is the original documentation establishing the pattern. The corroborating records from my witnesses establish it as systematic rather than isolated. Eduardo Rodriguez's land office records identify the accumulation vehicle. He paused. And I have in my office in Cheyenne 2 letters from Harlan Voss to the Denver Railroad Company's Land Acquisition Committee dated 1884 and 1886 in which he represents himself as the owner of a land corridor he did not yet own, land he subsequently acquired through the mechanisms documented here. He committed fraud with the railroad company as well, Margaret said. He told them he controlled land he was planning to steal. Whitmore's expression was that of a man who has learned to be very precise with his language. Yes, Cole leaned forward. What happens to the water allocation vote? It's in 8 days. The territorial water allocation process is outside my jurisdiction. My mandate is federal land fraud. Whitmore looked at both of them. However, and I want to be precise about this, the federal charges once filed would trigger a regulatory hold on all property transactions in which Voss has a financial interest. That would include the debt notes he holds on Alliance member properties. And it would, he paused, make it very difficult for him to exercise any authority in the water allocation process without exposing himself to additional charges of self-dealing in a federally investigated matter. The silence in the kitchen took on a different quality. When would you file? Margaret asked. I'm filing today, Whitmore said, from the telegraph office in town before I leave. He met her eyes directly. I want you to understand something, Mrs. Merritt. This case exists because your mother kept a record, and you kept it after her, and you understood what it meant, and you found the corroborating evidence that made it prosecutable. That is not a small thing. He paused. That is 12 years of patience and 8 weeks of remarkable work, and I want to acknowledge it before I file. Margaret looked down at the ledger on the table, her mother's handwriting. Her own handwriting filling in the gaps. My mother died not knowing if anyone would ever see this, she said. Someone saw it, Whitmore said simply, and it mattered. Voss found out before the afternoon was over. The news of the federal filing moved through Redemption Creek with the speed of things that are too significant to stay private, and by 4 o'clock, Margaret could feel the town shifting. Not toward her, not entirely, not yet, but away from the certainty it had carried for 12 years. That particular comfortable certainty that Harlan Voss was a fixture, that his authority was legitimate, that the people who struggled under his system had simply failed to thrive rather than been prevented from thriving. That certainty, once introduced to doubt, is a fragile thing. Voss arrived at the property personally. Margaret saw his buggy from the kitchen window and told Colin they went out together, which she was beginning to understand as the natural grammar of how they moved through the world now side by side. He looked different than he had at the courthouse, less certain in his suit. The smile still there, but working harder, which made it look like what it had always been. Mrs. Merritt, he did not acknowledge Cole. Think we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone. I don't think you know what benefits everyone, she said. I think you know what benefits you. He switched to Cole. Mr. Merritt, you're a reasonable man. Your wife has made some very serious accusations. Sorry. My wife published documented facts. Cole's voice was level, which I read before she sent them and which I can confirm are accurate. Voss absorbed this, the smile recalibrated. I'm prepared to forgive the outstanding educational fine. Full forgiveness. I'm also prepared to guarantee your water allocation at current levels regardless of the vote outcome. No reduction. Your property secured. He paused. In exchange for withdrawing the documents submitted to the federal auditor and issuing a public correction to the material published in the Gazette. Margaret looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Harlan, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name in his presence, and it landed differently than she intended, not familiarly, but with the weight of everything she knew about him. My mother kept records for 12 years. She kept them because she knew what you were doing to my father, and she knew what that would eventually do to this family, and she'd cried before she could do anything about it. I have spent the last 8 weeks working to make those records matter. She paused. There is no number. There is no guarantee. There is nothing you can offer that I want more than the truth being public. His expression went very still. The smile was gone. You're making a mistake, he said. If I am, it's mine to make. He looked at Cole one more time and Cole said nothing, which was the most complete thing he could have said. Voss drove away. Cole watched the buggy until it was out of sight. He's not done. He's not done, she agreed, but he's running out of moves. She turned back toward the house. The vote is in 7 days. We need to prepare the testimony. What testimony? From the Alliance families? Written statements signed documenting what this cooperative has meant to their operations, yield data, market data, educational outcomes. She was already inside, already at the table. We can't show wheat. We'll show everything else. Cole sat down across from her. Tell me what to do. Right. She pushed paper toward him. I'll dictate. Your handwriting is more legible than mine. Is this the compliment you lead with? I lead with accuracy. She picked up her pen. Ready? Ready, he said, and they got to work. The 6 days before the vote were the fullest Margaret could remember. The Alliance families came in shifts to provide testimony to review what had been written about them, to understand what they were walking into. Several were frightened. A few had received visits from Voss's lawyer carrying vague warnings about the consequences of public involvement in a federal investigation. None of them withdrew. Harriet Peterson's oldest son, who was 14 and had learned to read in Margaret's kitchen 8 weeks ago, brought his written testimony himself, 2 careful pages in a handwriting that had not existed 2 months prior, describing what literacy had meant to his family's ability to manage farm correspondence, read contracts, understand their legal rights. He handed it to Margaret and stood very straight and said, I want them to know it was real. They'll know, she said. Lucy Huang's testimony was precise and numerical, which Margaret suspected had been deliberate. Lucy understood that numerical evidence carries different weight than personal narrative and had arranged her data accordingly. Frank Dawson wrote, I was wrong about Margaret Ashford. I was wrong the same way this town has been wrong about a lot of things it didn't try to understand. I'm putting this down in writing because I'm old enough to know that being wrong is only a problem if you don't correct it. Margaret read that one twice. The night before the vote, she and Cole sat on the porch again, which had become their place, the place where the armor came off and the real conversations happened. Are you ready? He said. No. She leaned back. I've been preparing for this for 8 weeks and for years before that in ways I didn't recognize. But walking into that room tomorrow and standing up in front of the whole town and making the case, I don't know if I'm ready for that. She paused. I'm doing it regardless. I know. You'll be there. Every moment. She looked at the field. The ash of the wheat barn was still visible at the edge of the property, dark against the dirt. But the irrigation channels were running properly for the first time in years. And beyond the ash, the north field still held the green that had appeared before the fire, fragile, thin, but alive. Cole, yes. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that this, she gestured at the space between them, at the house, at the field, at the improbable fact of their life together, is worth more to me than the land. She said it carefully because she meant it carefully. I have spent my entire adult life fighting for this property because it was the last thing my father left, and because letting Voss take it felt like letting him win. But somewhere in the last 8 weeks, she paused. The thing I'm fighting for changed. The land matters because of what's on it now. The community, the work, you. Cole was quiet for a moment, then, I married you because I had no other option and I was trying to save my brother's mess. And then you showed me the ledger, and you showed me the alliance, and you taught me what strength actually looks like. Not the version I've been operating with for 35 years, the one that means enduring and being stoic and not needing anything. He looked at her. You taught me the other kind, the kind that knows what it needs and builds toward it anyway, the kind that isn't less strong for being honest about the cost. She looked at him. I love you, she said. I said it before, but I want to say it again, without the context of impending disaster, which is the only other time I've said it. I love you, he said, and tomorrow we win. We might not win. Then we lose standing up, and that's something too. She took his hand. The Wyoming night settled around them, cold and enormous and indifferent, and they sat in it together, which made it smaller, which made it bearable, which was she had come to understand the entire point. The town hall was more crowded than Margaret had ever seen it. People stood along the walls and sat in the window wells and pressed into the back corners. She recognized faces she had not expected, families from the outer county who had no direct stake in the water allocation vote, but had read the Gazette or heard from someone who had. She recognized Rose Hennessy near the back, standing very quietly with her coat fastened all the way to the collar. She recognized Eduardo Rodriguez's brother Ramon, who had driven in from the Western Ranch. She recognized in the second row Edna Greer, who had the particular posture of a woman attending a funeral for something she had believed in. Council Chairman Aldrich Porter called the meeting to order with 3 bangs of his gavel, that the crowd required time to settle for. At the front table, Harlan Voss sat with his lawyer to one side, and Margaret noticed no one to the other. His customary committee members had arranged themselves with more distance from him than usual. Not conspicuous distance, just the natural redistribution of people who have received new information and are recalibrating where they stand. This session addresses water allocation for properties flagged for below threshold productivity. Porter said, "The Merritt property has been under review. Mr. Voss, as the creditor holding notes on several properties in this district, you've been invited to address the council." Voss stood. He was composed. She had to give him that he was composed with the thoroughness of a man who has survived public challenges before and knows that confidence is its own argument. "The facts are straightforward," he said. "The Merritt property has failed to meet productivity thresholds for 3 consecutive years. The current occupants, Mr. and Mrs. Merritt, have made improvements this season, but those improvements were not tested. The harvest was destroyed in a fire last month. Without yield evidence, the property remains below threshold, and the community's water resources should be allocated accordingly." He sat down. Chairman Porter looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Merritt, you may respond." She stood. She had rehearsed this 100 times in the kitchen, in the field, in the hours before dawn, when sleep was unavailable. She had a prepared statement, organized and precise, and she had the testimony of 12 families, and she had her mother's ledger and Rose's documents and Eduardo's records and Grant Whitmore's federal filing, and she realized, looking at the room, the additional evidence of all the faces watching her, which included people who had whispered about her for a decade and people who had never spoken to her at all, and people who had shown up at 3 in the morning with shovels. She set down her prepared statement. "Chairman Porter, council members, I had a speech prepared." She looked at the room. "I'm going to set it aside because what I actually want to say is simpler." The room was very quiet. "Harlan Voss is right that I have no wheat harvest to present. The barn that held our harvest burned one day after I published documentation of his involvement in 12 years of fraudulent debt manipulation in this county." She let that sit. "The federal land auditor from Cheyenne has filed formal charges. The investigation is ongoing. Mr. Voss's ability to conduct business in this territory is at present subject to federal regulatory review." She looked at the council. "I want you to be aware of that context before you vote." Voss's lawyer moved to object. Chairman Porter raised a hand. "Continue, Mrs. Merritt." "What I can present is not a wheat yield. What I can present is this." She placed a folder on the council table. 12 families, their testimony, their documented outcomes from the Cooperative Farming Alliance established on this property over the past 8 weeks. She did not read from the folder. She had read it too many times to need to. Frank Dawson's Southfield yield improved 42% following irrigation consultation provided by this property, and Frank will tell you himself in a moment. Lucy Huang's family has new market relationships in Cheyenne and Laramie that have increased their annual income by a third. Lucy will speak to that. The Rodriguez family has grazing access that has allowed their cattle operation to expand. Ramon is here. Harriet Peterson's children can read. All 4 of them. Her oldest wrote his testimony himself. She paused. The water allocation criteria state that resources should support properties contributing to the community's agricultural welfare and productive use of resources. I submit that this community, she gestured at the room, is the evidence. These people, their outcomes, their futures, the cooperation that has replaced the isolation that men like Harlan Voss profit from maintaining. She looked at the council directly. If productive use of resources means only wheat per acre, then exclude me. But if it means something larger, if it means communities that function, children who can read, families who help each other survive, then I have more than met the threshold. She sat down. The room erupted. Frank Dawson stood without waiting to be called on. Lucy Huang was on her feet before he finished. Harriet Peterson's 14-year-old son, James, stood with the careful dignity of someone taking an action he understands the weight of and is willing to carry. Chairman Porter let it continue longer than strict procedure warranted. Margaret thought she understood why he was a man who was watching something happen that he had not expected and was not sure what to do with. When the testimony subsided, he called for council deliberation. The 5 council members gathered. Margaret sat very still. Cole's hand was on her arm, not her hand, her arm, the specific steadying contact of someone who understands exactly how much effort stillness is costing you. The deliberation took 11 minutes. When Chairman Porter returned to the podium, he had an expression she could not read, which in her experience meant he had reached a conclusion that surprised him. "Before I announce the council's decision," he said, "there is additional business. This morning I received formal notification from the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne." He held up a document. "Harlan Voss has been placed under federal injunction pending investigation into land fraud charges. All property interests and debt notes held by Mr. Voss in this district are subject to a regulatory hold. As a result, Mr. Voss's standing to participate in this proceeding as a creditor is suspended pending federal review." Porter set the document down. "The council has voted. The Merritt property retains full water allocation. Furthermore, we are establishing a community resources board to review water allocation criteria with an emphasis on community contribution standards as well as raw yield data." He paused. "The council is asking Mrs. Merritt to chair that board." The room came apart. Margaret did not hear it exactly. There was a sound collective and enormous, and Cole was on his feet, and people were surrounding her, and somewhere Harriet Peterson was crying in the uncomplicated way of someone for whom relief is so large, it has to come out somewhere. But she was hearing it from a slight distance through the specific filter of a moment so large that the full measure of it resists immediate processing. Rose Hennessy found her in the crowd and took her hands and didn't say anything, which was right. Lucy Huang, brisk and unsentimental, as always, said, "Good. Now we have work to do." Frank Dawson shook Cole's hand with the grip of a man who has revised a significant opinion and is prepared to say so. "Your wife," he said, "is the most remarkable person I have met in 60 years of living in this territory." "I know," Cole said. "I'm still catching up." When the hall had cleared enough to move, Margaret found herself at the back exit with Cole beside her and the cold Wyoming afternoon waiting outside. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the noise of celebration behind her and the silence of the open land ahead. "It's over," she said. She said it like a question because it didn't feel like over felt like. "This part," Cole said. "The next part starts now." She stepped outside. The air was sharp and clean and smelled like the particular clarity that comes after a long effort reaches its resolution. "He's not gone," she said. "Voss, the investigation would take time. There would be proceedings and testimony and the slow machinery of federal law, and none of it would be clean or fast." "No, but he's not directing anything anymore." Cole stepped out beside her. The power he had, the kind that operated through debt and silence and isolation, that's gone, because you exposed it and built something in its place that can't be rebuilt from secrecy. He looked at her. "He can have the legal process. He can't have the community." She stood in the cold light and let that settle into her bones. The road back to their property ran through the main street of Redemption Creek, and they drove it together in the wagon, and people who had never looked at her directly came out of storefronts and houses to acknowledge the passing. And Margaret Ashford, Margaret Merritt, looked back at all of them. Not with triumph, which was a kind of ego she found distasteful. With presence. With the particular clarity of a person who has spent years making themselves small and has decided irrevocably to stop. The barn went up in the 3 weeks. The Alliance families brought lumber and iron fittings and labor and more food than 12 people could eat over the course of a long working weekend. And they built the thing together on a Saturday with a cold blue sky overhead and children running between the adults with water buckets and nails. And by the end of the day, the frame was standing, and Harriet Peterson's youngest had fallen asleep in the back of the wagon with sawdust in her hair. Edna Greer came on the second day. She arrived alone and without announcement, wearing her work clothes and carrying a casserole dish, and she went straight to Margaret before she could lose her nerve. "I owe you an apology," she said. Margaret looked at her. "I was unkind for a long time, deliberately, and I told myself it was because you were unusual, and unusual was unsafe, and I was protecting something." Edna's voice was careful, like she was testing each word before she used it. "But that wasn't true. The truth is that you made me feel small by existing, and I responded by trying to make you smaller." A pause. "That's, a terrible thing to confess to someone you've wronged." "It's an honest one," Margaret said. Your daughter is going to need to know that women can be cruel to each other and that it doesn't mean anything is wrong with her. Edna met her eyes. I'd like to be the person who teaches her that some women eventually figure out better. Margaret looked at this woman who had called her cursed and marked and unnatural for 10 years and felt the exact weight of the choice in front of her, the one that required deciding whether people were the worst things they had done or something more complicated. Bring the casserole inside, she said. There's enough work for everyone. The day Edna Greer stood in the half-built barn and helped Margaret sort donated supplies was the day that something in Redemption Creek's relationship with itself shifted that could never quite shift back. Ethan's brother arrived in April. He came on a Tuesday morning, thinner than Cole had described him, and older than Margaret had imagined, and he stood at the yard gate for a long moment before he made himself come through it. Cole met him there, and they stood together in the way that brothers stand, not touching, not quite, but with a proximity that was its own kind of embrace. Margaret gave them time. When they came inside, she made coffee and sat across from Daniel Merritt and said without preamble, "You're sober." Daniel blinked. 6 months. Good, that's hard. She set down his coffee. Cole tells me you're planning to go to California. You owe yourself a life. She met his eyes. Whatever you owe Cole, and it's less than you think because he chose every piece of it, you can't repay it from a posture of debt. You can only repay it by becoming someone worth having chosen. She held his gaze. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I spent 12 years believing I was a debt to the world for being the wrong kind of woman, and it almost destroyed me before I figured out that was someone else's accounting and not mine. Daniel stared at her. California is fine, she said. Go, build something. Write to us when you get there. She pushed his coffee toward him. And come back when you have something to come back to. When he left the next morning, Cole stood at the gate watching his brother's wagon diminish toward the horizon. Margaret stood beside him. You didn't try to convince him to stay, Cole said. He needed to go. She leaned against him slightly. He'll come back when he's ready. He put his arm around her shoulders, which had become natural over the weeks since the vote, a language of small contact that said the things they didn't need to say aloud anymore, because they had found other ways to say them. He'll be all right, he said. It wasn't quite a question. He has a brother who loves him beyond reason, she said. People like that usually manage. She told him about the baby on a morning when the second planting was 3 days in and the whole north field smelled like turned earth and beginning. He had come in from the fields for the midday break and found her at the kitchen table with the particular stillnesses of someone who has been sitting with a significant fact for long enough to arrive at equanimity. I'm pregnant, she said. He set down the cup he had been reaching for, stood very still. How far, he said. About 10 weeks. I saw the doctor on Tuesday. She watched him absorb it. I know the timing is... He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she was on her feet and he had his arms around her, which was not the careful, deliberate kind of contact they had been building toward, but something completely unguarded. And she felt him breathe out in the specific way of someone releasing something they had been holding without knowing it. Are you all right? He said into her hair. I'm frightened, she said, and happy. Both at the same time, and I'm not sure either one is the right response, which is the most terrifying thing I know. He laughed. She felt it against her shoulder. I think both is exactly right, he said. She pulled back enough to see his face. Are you Boa? Yes. He said it before she finished the question. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed too, which surprised her. It came from somewhere underneath the fear and the planning and the calculation from the part that had been very quiet for a very long time and was beginning to relearn the things that quiet suppresses. It's going to be a lot of work, she said. We've done a lot of work. More work than the farm and the alliance and the federal case combined. Probably. He tucked a strand of her hair back with the careless ease of someone who has been doing small domestic things for enough weeks that they don't require thought anymore. We'll figure it out. We will, she agreed. We're very good at figuring things out. We have documentation. She laughed again, and it felt like something coming loose that had been held too tight for too long. The renewal ceremony happened in June when the wheat was knee-high and the barn was finished and the sun stayed long in the Wyoming sky with the generosity of seasons that have decided finally to cooperate. It was Margaret's idea, which surprised Cole. She was not by nature a person who needed ceremonies, who thought that feelings required ritual confirmation. But she had told him one evening in the way she told him most important things quietly in the kitchen, as a statement of fact rather than a request, that the wedding they had was not a wedding. It was an arrangement, and she wanted once to stand in front of the people who had actually chosen to be in her life and say the things that the courthouse ceremony had not permitted. The pastor did it in the new barn. Every Alliance family came. Eduardo Rodriguez came from Laramie. Rose Hennessy came wearing the look of someone permitted finally to be present in her own right rather than as a shadow. Edna Greer came and sat in the front row next to Harriet Peterson, which would have been unimaginable 8 months ago. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself from fabric and that the Alliance families had collectively contributed, piece by piece, each scrap from a different household. It did not match. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. Cole wore his good shirt, which was not very good, and his expression, which was. The pastor asked for vows, and Margaret spoke first because she had written them, and because if she didn't say them soon, she was going to have to confront the fact that she was crying, which she did not do, except that she was. I vow to be honest with you, she said, even when honesty is harder than silence. I vow to fight beside you and not for you because you don't need someone to fight for you, and I am not the kind of woman who fights instead of her partner when she can fight with him. I vow to use my voice and to respect yours and to build something between us that neither of us could have built alone. She squeezed his hands. And I vow to remember every day that the best thing Harlan Voss ever did for me was force me into a room with you. Laughter from the barn, the real kind, the kind that comes from people who know the full story and find it in retrospect exactly as absurd as it is. Cole waited until it settled. I vow to stand beside you, he said, in the places where the world would rather you stand behind. I vow to be the person who knows your whole story and chooses you anyway, not despite the difficult parts, but including them because the difficult parts are how I found you. He paused. I vow to stop sleeping so far from you that I can't hear you breathe, which I recognize is specific but is important to me. More laughter. And I vow to keep choosing this, you, the work, the life we're building every single day for as long as I'm capable of choosing. The pastor said the words that made it official, the same words that had been said in the courthouse 8 months ago in front of witnesses who had wanted it to fail. These witnesses cheered. 6 months after the vote, three things happened that Margaret marked as significant. The first, Harlan Voss was formally indicted on 7 counts of federal land fraud. The trial was scheduled for spring in the territorial capital. He would not be returning to Redemption Creek in any capacity that mattered. The second, the community school opened, a proper building, a one-room schoolhouse that the Alliance families had built over the course of a working month on land that the community had donated. Margaret had trained 3 other teachers over the summer. Harriet Peterson's oldest son, who could now read at a level that astonished people who had known him as an illiterate child 8 months ago, had been offered an apprenticeship with the Territorial Surveyor's Office in Laramie. He had accepted. The third, Redemption Creek elected 2 women to the town council. One was Lucy Huang, who stood and spoke at the election meeting with the flat numerical precision that Margaret had learned was her mode of maximum conviction. The other was Harriet Peterson, who stood at the same meeting and said simply, I want my children to see what it looks like when women run things. I think they've been waiting long enough. Margaret watched the votes counted from a seat in the third row holding Cole's hand. You started this, he said quietly. We started this. She watched the count. And they finished it. That's how it works. The numbers came in. Both women won. The room made a noise that Margaret felt in her chest. On the anniversary of the wedding, the courthouse won, the one that hadn't felt like a wedding. Margaret stood in the north field at sunset with Gould beside her, and Eleanor Ada Merritt, who was 3 months old and was sleeping in her father's arms with the absolute boneless confidence of a person who has never had reason to distrust the person holding her. The wheat was harvested and stored in the barn that 12 families had built. The irrigation channels ran the way they were supposed to. The school had been open for 3 weeks and already had 14 students. Margaret looked at all of this, the field and the barn and the house and the road that ran into Redemption Creek, where some things were different and some things were the same, and the difference this year was that the ones that were different were the ones that mattered. "Do you regret it?" Cole said. Not for the first time. She had asked him the same question the opposite direction too many times to count. Which part? Any of it. She looked at Eleanor Ada asleep in the crook of his arm, one fist curled against her cheek with the determined intensity that had been her mode of operating since approximately birth. "I regret that my father died," she said. "I regret that my mother spent 12 years keeping a record she never got to use. I regret every year I spent believing that there was something wrong with me for being what I am." She paused. "I don't regret a single thing that came after the courthouse. Not the fear, not the fight, not the parts that almost broke me." She looked at him. "Not you." Cole adjusted his hold on Eleanor Ada without looking away from Margaret. "I was a man who thought he was being responsible," he said. "I thought sacrificing for Daniel was strength. I thought needing nothing was strength. I thought—" He paused. "I had no idea what strength actually was until I watched you do it for 8 weeks straight in circumstances that would have finished someone without your particular stubbornness." "My stubbornness," she repeated. "Is that the compliment you're leading with? It's my favorite thing about you. It's in the top 3. What's first? You're mine." He said it immediately without deliberation. "The way you think, the way you see things and then figure out what to do about them. I have never met anyone who moves from observation to action the way you do." She looked at him for a moment. "You're going to make me cry," she said. "I don't cry." "You cry more than you think you do." "I cry an appropriate amount given the circumstances I have been living in." "That's fair." Eleanor Ada shifted in her sleep and made a small sound that was not quite a word and not quite a protest, but something in between, which was, Margaret thought, already very on brand. The sun finished setting. Redemption Creek lit up window by window in the valley below. Families settling in for the evening, fires being built, the ordinary domestic machinery of lives proceeding. She had spent 32 years not belonging to any of it, pressed against the glass of a community that had decided before she opened her mouth that she was too much of the wrong things. She was not outside any of it now. "She's going to grow up here," Margaret said. "Yes. She's going to know what her mother did. Every bit of it." He looked at the baby and her father's supporting role. "Don't undersell yourself. Don't oversell me." He looked at her. "You were already fighting before I got here. I just showed up in time to be useful." "You were more than useful." She said it quietly and meant it completely. "You were the thing that made it possible to believe the fight was worth having. Not the land, not the case. You." She looked at him. "I didn't know I was waiting for that. I didn't know that was what was missing." The last light left the sky. Eleanor Ada slept on unknowing in the arms of a father who had become one by accident and stayed one by choice on land that had nearly been taken and had been kept by a kind of effort that made every crop that grew from it something more than grain. In the farmhouse behind them, her grandmother's ledger was in the desk drawer where Margaret kept it. Not hidden, visible. Available. Evidence that records matter, that documentation is its own kind of courage, that women who write things down are doing something that persists beyond what any single life can achieve alone. Margaret Ashford had been called many things. The professor's daughter, the reader, the leftover, unmarried, difficult, too much, not enough. She had believed some of them for a long time the way you believe things that are repeated consistently enough and by enough voices. She had arranged herself around those beliefs, shrinking to fit the shape they implied. She was not that person anymore. She was Margaret Merritt, who chaired the Water Resource Board and ran the literacy program, and had argued a federal fraud case into existence with her mother's handwriting and her own stubbornness in the help of people who had chosen her. She was a wife in the actual sense, not the legal category, but the living fact of two people who had been trapped together and found improbably that the trap had led somewhere worth arriving. She was a mother new to it, learning its weight and texture one day at a time. She was the woman who had refused at 32 to accept that refusing was the same as failing. The wheat moved in the evening wind. She reached over and took Cole's free hand, the one not holding Eleanor, and he closed his fingers around hers without looking away from the valley, and they stood together in Redemption Creek in the last of the light, and none of the things that had tried to break them had broken them, and they were still here. They were still here. That was everything.